This is part 4 of the Fullstack web application development series with JavaScript. And today we're going to start to put some pieces together. In the previous lessons, in lessons 1 and 2, we created an Express server. And then we created a Mongo database and some models that allow us to read data from our Mongo database. Then in lesson 3, we looked at how to create the UI with React. And so today what we're going to do is we're going to stitch those two things together into a single application. So what's going to happen is we're going to have an Express server running, and at the same time we're going to have our React server or UI running. They're going to be running at the same time, but they're going to be able to talk to each other. So we'll figure out exactly how to configure everything. There'll be less coding here in this lesson and more just configuration and getting things up and running. Just so we recall where we were at, I have a directory here called Fullstack Tutorial, and this has our Express server. If you recall, it has the Express server. We configured our routes and things like that, and it also has our models and config files to connect to our Mongo database. Down here, I have a directory called React Tutorial, which is our UI where we created some basic components. And this is where we had code where we could just render those simple cards that rendered some data that we defined right in that program. So today, we're actually going to retrieve data from the database, from the Express server, and render that data into our React components. So the first thing that we're going to do is we need to combine these two projects. The starting point for the project is going to be our Express server, Fullstack Tutorial. So I'm just going to start by copying the React tutorial, our client code, into that folder. So you see we've got React tutorial. What I'm going to do is I'm actually going to rename this to client, just to make it clear. So our server code is here, and then our client code is in the client directory. Now, as I mentioned before, we're going to have two servers running. Our Express server is going to be running on port 3001 on our local machine, and the React server is going to be running on, the UI is going to be running on port 3000. So we need to do some configuration here to allow those two things to happen at the same time. So I'm going to go to Visual Studio Code. We're going to open up this new combined project. So I'm just going to go to Fullstack Tutorial, which now has everything, and I'm going to open it up. So here's everything that we've got right now. If you see here, we've got our server code and our client code. You also note that we have two package JSONs. They have separate dependencies, our client and our server, and that's just fine. So the first thing we're going to do just to get started, I need to update our server so that it's running on a separate port. So all I need to do is in our server file is tell it to run on port 3001 instead of 3000. So that will have our Express server running on port 3001 and our React UI, as I said, running on port 3000. The second thing that I need to do is I'm going to close out this. I need to update the package.json for our server. It used to be that when we'd start our server, and I have some code in here that I'd already done, so I'm going to undo that. When we type in yarn start, it would just start the Express server. So if I type in yarn start right now, it just will start the Express server on port 3001 because I changed that. That's fine, but now we also want to start the React client as well, running on port 3000. And we're going to use a tool called concurrently to do that. Concurrently just allows you to run two tasks at the same time. So it'll just allow us to run our client and our server. So the first thing I need to do is install that package here. So we'll just say yarn install concurrently -d. And so, yarn add. It's npm, using npm. you would say install. But we have concurrently, and you can see that it gets added to our package.json. This concurrently package, and I use the -d flag because it's a development dependency. Something that we're using in our development environment is not something that the application itself runs on. So now we type in yarn start. We want to start both the client and the server. We're going to use concurrently to do that. So up here in our start command, we're going to say concurrently. And because this whole command is in a double quotes, I need to put each command that is running in parallel in quotes. So I'm going to flag that with a \quotes. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to start nodemon server.js, just like we did before. But then at the same time, we're going to start another task, and we're going to run another node command, start client.js. Now this file doesn't exist yet, but we're going to create it in just a second. So when we type in yarn start, it's going to run nodemon server.js, that'll launch the server, and it's also going to call node start client.js, that is going to start our client for us. So the next thing we need to do is actually create this start client file. So I'm going to say new file right here in the main directory, call it start client.js. So this is a file, and basically what we're going to do is we want to spawn a child process, and we've got some tools here in JavaScript to do that. So I'm going to set this up real quickly. I'll just walk you through exactly what you need to do that. We're going to set up a couple of variables here, const args equals. You could just hard code this, but it's preferable to put these in some variables so that you can change them along the way. And const our options for this. When we spawn a process, we have to pass arguments and options to it. So standard IO, inherit. We're going to inherit the same standard IO as from the parent process. And then CWD, what working directory we are going to be using. This is probably the most important thing. It basically says we're going to work in the client directory and not in the root directory. And then one last argument, shell true. So that's what we need. And so now we just type in require child process. So this will launch a child process or spawn. And we tell it what process to spawn, npm, and then we pass in the arguments and the options. So just to explain a little bit of what this does, so it's going to spawn a process. It's going to run the npm command, because if you recall, to start our React UI, what we did is we typed in npm start. So we're going to do the same thing here. npm, we're going to spawn a process that runs npm, and we're going to pass in the start argument to it. And then we're going to pass these other options to it. And what's most important is that we're going to run that from the client directory. So it's going to launch npm start in the client directory. So pretty straightforward. At this point, we could actually try it out and see if we've got both things up and running. So if we go here and just say yarn start, it should launch concurrently and do these two things at the same time. So you can see it's running our Express server on port 3001, and then it also ran that React launcher too. And you can see our React application that we had before is up and running on port 3000. Pretty slick. So right now we actually have our Express server running on port 3001 and our React app running on port 3000, our UI. Now we still need to do a few more things. I'm going to hit Control-C to close this out. There's a few things we need to do to get things talking and working together. I'm going to go into the client directory and open the package.json file. Now here, this is our React client that's running on port 3000. And NPM provides us with a little tool to proxy requests for us to the server automatically. Basically, anything that React needs, any static assets that are run from this client directory will be run here. But if we make a request to something that is not in this static asset in this directory, basically going to the index.html, we can set up a proxy that says route that request somewhere else. So I'm opening package.json. We're just going to add one line in here. It just says proxy. And we're going to proxy to HTTP localhost 3001. And basically what that is saying is if it's not local data, route that request to port 3001, which is, of course, where our Express server is running. I just want to show you one thing. This is not running anymore, but I do want to show you this. We'll start this going again. We've got a React app. We're going to reload it here. It should be coming up here in a sec. Dun, dun, dun. It's coming up. We'll see that going. At the same time, localhost 3001 API users. You can see that I have my Express server running here and a React app running on 3000. They're both running. And now I am sending any requests. Actually, I'll show you this. So now if I say API users, that's not local content to this app. It will know to, I need to recompile this, but it will know to route it to our, basically to the Express server. So one thing I do want to do just to make sure we've got everything all right, I'm going to do a yarn install here to make sure all our dependencies are up to date on our server and do it here. Just make sure we've got all of our dependencies installed. Good for our client. All right, we're set there. So now we've got our client and our server running. Hopefully we've got our routing happening, our proxy set up. Now the next thing we're going to do is we're going to modify our client code. If you recall, I'm going to go to app.js. If you remember here, we're rendering these cards just from some data that we hard coded in here. So we're going to do some new things with React now that will allow us to fetch data from our server. So the first thing I need to do is I'm going to get rid of this. We don't want any static data. We want to get it from the server. Within React, we talked a little bit about props. So for a component, you can pass properties to that component. Like in this case, we have a property called users, and we pass in some data to that properties. A component can also have state. These are different things. Properties are things that are passed to you, and state is data that you either get from the server. State is data that can change on that component. If you receive a property from a parent component, you should never change it. So this user list component should never change the properties that are sent to it. But you can React has this concept called state, which is data that you can change and work with, or data that might get loaded from the database or based on user input and things like that. So we're going to use state. We're going to load data from the database and put it into the state of this React component. So in order to do that, we have to do a few things. On our component, all we have this very basic component. It just renders the UI. We're going to add a constructor to it, and the constructor will always take the properties that are passed to the component, and this is just required. We pass our properties up to our parent object, and then in our constructor, the one important thing we need to do is set our initial state for this component. So just say this.state. State is a reserved word with React, and a state is an object. And we're just going to say users, and we're going to set it to null. So our state now has one attribute, a variable, users, which will end up being our array of users just like we had before. And we're setting it to null when we initialize this component. Now, another cool part of React is there are several functions called lifecycle functions. Things happen, functions get called when certain things happen. For example, when a component is about to get rendered on the screen, it will call a function called component will mount, and then it will also call a function called component did mount. And so basically what that allows us to do is when we know that we're about to load this component on the screen, we can do whatever work we need to do to get that component to render on the screen. So that might be a little confusing. Hopefully this will make sense. So I'm actually going to use the component did mount function. And I don't have to call this. Basically what happens is whenever in index.js you will see when we start our application, it's going to render the app component. And before it renders it, it's going to call component will mount. And after it starts to render it on the screen, after it renders it on the screen initially, it will call component did mount. So it's going to mount initially with no users, and we're going to take care of that in a bit. And then after the component is mounted, we're going to go get data to populate the component. So hopefully that'll make sense. I'm just going to use the basic browser fetch API to get our data from the server. So if you recall, localhost 3001 API users. I don't have this running right now. I want to call API users to get that list of users. So I'm gonna use the browser API fetch, and I'm gonna say API users. I'm gonna call API users, and I'm just gonna pass in one header to this. Accept application JSON. So basically saying I'm gonna get JSON back. So fetch will get data from API user. And as we said before, because this is not static data, it will automatically get proxied because of this to localhost 3001. So we'll call localhost 3001 API users. Fetch is an asynchronous command, so then we just say, then we'll get a response back. And with that response, I'm just going to read the JSON data that comes back. Return the response.json. So get that JSON object. And this is just a little funny on this async from fetch. Then now I've got the data that came back. So this is going to return just the data, the JSON data that came back. And what will we do with that data? We're going to call another React API that says this.set state. And now we can update the state. And I'm just going to show you one little thing here. I don't want to reset. So if I had 10 different things in the state, I don't want to reset them all to null. I just want to update the users here. So basically this spread operator in JavaScript just says unpack everything that's currently in the state, but then update the users with the data that we got from the database. So now we should have the state of the component set to the data that we got from our Express server and MongoDB. The one other thing we need to do now, users is not defined in our render function. We need to tell the render function to get this users variable from state. So it's just very simple. We'll just say var users equals this.state. So basically saying get users from the state, then pass it as a property to the user list. So that's what we need to do to get our data from the server. The one thing that I also want to touch base on a little bit is I want to clean up this user list component. If you recall, in our React demo, I think we had a username and an age. In our Express data, in the Mongo database that we created, we have a username and an email address. So I'm going to update the user list component, and I'm going to do several things in here. It's still getting the same properties. This.props.users still comes in from the parent component who creates it. But I'm going to do something a little bit different here. First of all, I want to see if I don't have any users loaded, I want to display something that says I don't have any users. So the first thing I want to do is I want to see if there is anything in this .props.users. If it's null, then we'll do something else. But if it's not null, so this ternary operator says, is this null? If it is this value contain something? If it does, is it true or truthy? If it does, then we're going to do all of this work that we were already doing, basically creating cards for each user. Otherwise, we're just going to return a simple div that says something like no users. So this isn't going to look real pretty, but get running here. So what do I have here? Got mapping return this .props.users map. Oh, I need sorry. Just these get a little bit wonky with. Otherwise, I can pull this up here. Otherwise, and so basically, if we have any users, render them, and if not, render this little div that just says no users. The other thing that I want to do is we're not using the age anymore. We're going to do email, and email there. And then, so I better quick update that in users. So instead of age, I want to say email and email. So now I think we have everything set up so that we can render our application. So we're going to go ahead and just do our yarn start here. And it's going to start our server and our client. It's going to run here. It's going to take a second to load. And it's going to come up here. And you may be able to see it flash briefly that it says no users, and then it will load the data from our Mongo database once it is up and running. All right. Oh, state is not defined. Let's see. Line 25 of our app. Oh, I got to put this dot state. So fix that quick. It will reload for us. So it says no users. And let's see here. Res.json. Let's look and see at what is coming from our server here. I'm going to put on my terminal here. It says not found. So it must be, I must have an issue here with talking to our server. I'm going to reload this page. So you can see it says no users, then it should go out. Oh, I called user, not users. So it's not finding it. It's trying to go out to get API user. Fetch API users. We'll see what that does. And where am I going to here? It's trying to get out to API users. So we'll just say, there we go, users. There we go. So now I've got the right address. So it just is going to users. It's proxying to 3001. And then you can see it gets the data back, the JSON data from our server, just like if we had done localhost API users, just like that. And when it gets that data back, then it updates the state and re-renders the component. So it re-renders the user list component with the data that came from the server. So if we reload this, you can see really quickly, it will say, you might have been able to catch it before, it will say no users, and then it will flash to, it flashes no users while it's loading. You could put something in that says, might look better if we say something like, let's clean this up a little bit. Why don't we use some of our material UI components to make this look a little bit nicer? I'm going to pull in some of this stuff. I actually want to organize this a little better. But so now instead of returning a div, let's return a card. And let's put some card text. That says loading. So this looks a little bit better. So now when we load this, now let's see if we can catch this quick enough. You'll see really quickly, it says loading, and then it flips to that. And that's all based on this ternary operator. If this is null, it calls this, but as soon as it is set by the application, then it will render the user list. So basically at this point, now we have an Express server with a database. We have our React front end, we're getting data from it, and we're able to render it on the screen. From here, what we'll do is we're going to do some work with React Router to be able to render different pages, and that will be in the next tutorial.